What's up, party people? I'm Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for stopping by and checking out my channel. Today we're going to talk about trauma. I wrote a blog post about it recently. You can check that on my website. I just kind of introduced the topic. I didn't go super in depth. I'm not going to go super in depth today in this YouTube video either. I'm just kind of going to extrapolate a little bit on what I talked about in the blog. So trauma's a thing a lot of people are dealing with, and that's kind of what the blog's about. So the blog is titled "We All Have Trauma," and so I want to kind of talk about that. The idea of trauma in our modern society is actually pretty good. People are mostly aware of it. Like it's not a weird diagnosis. It's not something people struggle with. People aren't usually in denial about it. There is occasionally like some still, like I would say, shaming around having trauma. Because some people have a traumatic event and they have a trauma response from it, and some people don't. And that's one of the weird things with trauma is not everybody who goes through the same experiences is going to have trauma. So some people get PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from being in a car accident, and some people's brains process it fine. And so a lot of times there's still that little bit of guilt and shame. But overall, I would say trauma as a concept is one that's pretty well accepted by a majority of people, which is good and helpful for those people who are dealing with trauma. The issue is we've kind of limited trauma to being soldiers, people who go to war, first responders who see kind of gruesome accidents or are dealing with life and death situations. We think about car accidents, we think about getting mugged or robbed. We think of these kind of over-the-top or dramatic type experiences that cause significant life or death harm as what people experience as trauma. And the reality is trauma is anytime your brain thinks it might die. Anything that causes your brain to kind of face its own mortality can lead to a trauma response. And trauma is the brain's way of identifying fight or flight. So what kind of happens in these events where your brain is processing, should I run away or flee? You may have heard of it as fight, flight, or freeze. And some people even talk actually about a fourth option our brain has, which is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn kind of being the idea of like the fawn, a baby deer, being like nice and gentle and trying to smooth over a situation. Those are less well researched, I would say, not necessarily bad concepts. We typically refer to it as fight or flight, and I'm going to use that paradigm just because it's simpler. And if I have to repeat so many things that start with the same syllables, I screw up, as evidenced by having some outtakes in this video. So fight or flight response kind of is our brain's way of processing things. And that's really great, right? When we were less well civilized and living out in the country somewhere and there was a saber-toothed tiger, our brain went, oh no, a saber-toothed tiger, let's run away. Or, oh no, we're in a cave and the way out is blocked by this huge predator. I need to fight my way out. And so the fight or flight response really worked well. We see it in other animals that have a mammalian brain similar to ours where that freeze response comes in, such as like a mouse going through a field. They hear a predator like a hawk make a screech, they freeze. Unfortunately, predators like hawks have learned how to manipulate that, so they screech right before they dive, and then they go eat that poor mouse. Or maybe the mouse deserved it. I don't know. Maybe the hawk is the hero in the story. Anyway, fight or flight used to make a lot more sense. In our modern world, we don't have as much clear-cut stuff like that. While we could die in a car accident at any point, we don't really process that as a threat. It's not inherently scary to get behind the wheel. But what happens is when we get in an accident, our brain starts processing that risk differently. So those of you who have ever been in a car accident would have experienced being a pretty careful driver for a couple weeks to a couple months after getting in an accident. That's our brain working well. What happens with trauma, and specifically a complex trauma response, is your brain, that switch, and it's a metaphorical switch, it's not an actual switch in our brain, but it gets flipped, and then your brain has a hard time assessing what's a real threat and what isn't. And so people who have complex trauma and are processing that, their brain is processing nearly everything in fight or flight instead of using the rest of the brain's processing skills and executive functioning to be able to make good, healthy, well-informed decisions. So safety becomes paramount because everything is a threat. And that's kind of what happens with trauma. Now, one of the ways that I talk about it is big T trauma and little t trauma. So the way I was talking about trauma before, car accidents, sexual assault, physical assault, going to war, seeing someone die in front of you, being witness to violence, These things that we've kind of always associated with it, shell shock from World War I or World War II, these concepts of trauma have been around for a long time, but we've always kind of associated it with these big events. So that's big T trauma. Big T trauma, in the way that I talk about it, is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's in the DSM. We know what it looks like. It's flashbacks, it's dissociations, it's nightmares. It's kind of what pop culture has absorbed trauma to mean. But trauma, little t trauma, is being spanked, being yelled at by a parent when you were growing up, having a best friend move away suddenly or die, having a loved one die unexpectedly, and not in a dramatic way, not in a way that inherently caused you harm up front, but in a way that your brain faced its own mortality and decided something wasn't safe. And these traumatic events, the way that trauma sticks with us is the event may not be traumatic, but the way our brain processes it, it's what comes after the event. That's the trauma. And I think that's what a lot of people miss about it. So little t traumas can really be anytime we feel unsafe. Our brain thinks it could die. And if you're talking about a little kid, they don't really have a concept yet in their development. Their brain hasn't developed enough on just a purely biological basis to be able to assess threats reasonably. I have a 4-year-old and a almost 2-year-old. They do all sorts of dangerous stuff constantly because they have no concept of assessing these threats reasonably. It is fun to jump off a slide, so they're going to jump off the slide. They're not thinking through the risk at all. So when something raises that level of risk and our brain's still being developed, those can get locked in. And where it gets locked in is our central nervous system. And so the nervous system kind of carries a lot of these little t traumas with us. And what happens then is it's the brainstem, where it gets it gets carried in our body. But what happens on a brain level is it never really gets into the front part of our brain up here, where we have executive functioning, we have ability to problem solve, we have the ability to take past events and predict into the future. It's all these high level concepts that we use in our daily life for decision making. That part of the brain never gets activated when we're dealing with trauma. All that gets activated is the brainstem, and the brainstem is that fight or flight response. I'm oversimplifying some of the basics for other professionals or people who are studying brain science out there and want to talk to me about the amygdala. Like, I get it, but also we're keeping it simple here. So there are different parts of the brain that relate to this. The amygdala is the big one. I'm oversimplifying a little bit to say brainstem, but it's helpful to kind of think in terms of like, it's not going all the way up into our brain. It's instinct. That fight or flight is connected to our brainstem so that it can be quick. Our brain can assess a threat, fight or flight. Do we run away, or do we get into a big fight right now? And it sends messages to our muscles. And so where this gets carried in our body and why trauma is held in our body is because our body is on high alert. Our muscles are storing energy in case we have to run away or we have to fight. Our body is diverting resources away from other bodily functions because we're in that fight or flight mode. And so it could be affecting our appetite, it could be affecting our digestion, it could be affecting our sleep. We could get really sweaty, we could not be sweating enough. There's all these things that the body wants to control on kind of a subconscious level that the brain's trauma response is taken away from that. So trauma is really interesting in the sense that it's tough because a lot of people aren't noticing or aren't aware that what they're experiencing is a trauma response. And part of the way to deal with that is by training the brain to feel safe and getting the brain to start reassessing safety risks in a more reasonable manner. Not everything requires a fight or flight response. And so we have a whole other system in our body that gets summed up, and I like these mnemonic devices. We have fight or flight. We also have rest and digest. And so the rest and digest system is a lot of those other systems in our body that are running automatically that our nervous system is then interrupting. And so if we can tap into some of those things, that's one way to process the trauma. The big thing is to start identifying that this is trauma. So if there's something in your past or something in your present that your brain processed as being unsafe, and now you're on edge or your emotional regulation is off, trauma can look like a bunch of other things. So I work with a bunch of adults who have ADHD or aren't aware yet that they have ADHD, but they're dealing with it. And so again, like emotional dysregulation is a part of ADHD. Emotional dysregulation is a part of a lot of different things. So these trauma responses can be kind of tough to tease out. Most of us have trauma, though. Most of us have enough events in our past. It's just whether our brain has processed them in a healthy way or that's created kind of a stuck loop on this fight or flight response. So the first big thing when we're dealing with trauma is to identify that it's trauma. We need to know that our brain's short-circuiting, basically, and doing fight or flight, not going up into the brain and problem solving at all, just staying in the brainstem and going pure instinct, fight or flight. We need to see that's what's going on, and we need to self-soothe, right? So we can't really process or even reprocess any of the trauma, any of the past hurts, any of the feelings of risk or not feeling safe. We can't process any of that stuff in the moment because our brain's already not dealing with it. Our brain shuts itself off. Our brain kind of floods itself is what actually happens, but it's not using the whole concept. It's just like I'm trying to think of a good pop culture example. It's cliche though, right? When something's getting shut down, like there's this secret research lab and a patient broke loose, or a nuclear thing, and there's a reactor break or whatever. And like, I'm using pop culture, not scientific terms here. When those blast doors come down and everything gets locked down, like that's kind of what our brain's doing. And so it's shutting things down, and we're not using the whole system that the brain has to problem solve in a healthy way. So we need to self-soothe. Our brain needs to calm down. Our body needs to calm down. We're calming down the trauma response in our body first. So things like breathing techniques work really well. Grounding techniques, tapping into our five senses, being connected with the present moment. Even some people do tapping where they're tapping their fingers at different places around their body. That's one thing. Some people are stomping their feet on the ground. There's all these kind of different ways to do grounding techniques. Breathing techniques are another way. And these are all really great ways to self-soothe. And I'm not doing a video on self-soothing right now, so I'm kind of glossing over some of these things. I'm going fast, not glossing over. So we self-soothe, and then we can start to reassess whether we're actually in danger or not. And if we're not, if we're safe, if we're in a place and an environment that allows us to be safe, then we can start working on reprocessing some of these things. And how we reprocess some of these things is first by admitting that we're safe. And then we want to do some exercises where we're trying to teach the body to get into that rest and digest mode instead of fight or flight. We want to move away from the fight or flight. We might not get fully into rest and digest because that's when the body's pretty much at ease. So we want to get more, but something like eating, right? Eating is both a great grounding technique. A little extra tip, especially for eating protein, really helps ground our body. Protein's harder to digest, harder to break down, so it takes more energy. So there's all these fun components. I just hit my mic. There's all these fun components that come up with our body having to kind of get back in touch with itself. And that's what trauma is interrupting, and that's what reprocessing is kind of helping us do, is get back in touch with our body. It's reconnecting our brain back to our body so that there isn't a gap there. So one of the things that sometimes is going to happen is people are doing years and years of therapy without doing the trauma work, and it's not working because they're learning all these great tips, these great tools, these great ways to reframe, and cognitive behavioral therapy, go team, thought stopping. I don't like thought stopping. That's why I use that as an example for cognitive behavioral therapy, because I don't do cognitive behavioral therapy. There are all these intellectual things, and I'm an intellectual. Most of my clients will be like, yeah, Jared's an intellectual. He likes to overthink things with people. So I get that, but if we're not doing the body work, if we're not calming things down in the body, we're not ever getting to that point where we can do the intellectual work. Again, it's trapped in our brain stem, our brain's short-circuiting, and we're not getting to do that executive level processing and functioning in the frontal cortex. So it's one of those weird things where we have to kind of do the experiential, the body work. We have to process physically some of these things so that our brain can then tap into all the skills and all the tools that it has available. So it's pretty fun. I like, there's also really good research on the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is spread out across our body. It's in a bunch of different places. There's a bunch of different ways to stimulate it. Stimulating the vagus nerve leads to that rest and digest response. So you can look that up. I mean, that's as with anything on the internet, be wary of what's out there. But I would say just a general, my general perusal on the internet, on YouTube for just vagus nerve exercises has been pretty good. There's a lot of information out there on trauma release type stuff, trauma response type stuff. So it's grounding techniques. It's ways that your body and brain are connecting to slow down. So I think that's really great. Maybe I'll do another video specifically on that. So yeah, that's kind of the basis. We all have trauma. If our trauma has created a short circuit in our brain, we kind of have to address it as a trauma. Addressing it through other means without doing the trauma work just isn't going to accomplish what we want to accomplish. We're going to keep short circuiting in the way that trauma response has led to. So hope this was helpful. If anybody read the blog, wellnesswithjerry.com/blog, and wanted more details, here's more details. If you were interested in what I was talking about and you process things by reading, you can go check out the blog. Any questions or concerns, drop down in the comment. Like, subscribe, do all those YouTube things. I never plan how I'm going to end my videos, so I'm just rambling. So, peace.